Glenn Kirshner is a former federal prosecutor, has been attending the Oath Keepers trial in person. Barbara McQuade is a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, where she prosecuted a seditious conspiracy case against members of the Hutari militia, which resulted in acquittal on that charge. And let me go to you first, Barbara, on the significance here, given the difficulty of convicting on these charges. What does a jury have to find someone guilty of seditious conspiracy?
Yeah, it is a difficult charge to prove, Chris. It requires a showing of an agreement, a conspiracy, by two or more people to use force to oppose the authority of the United States government. And so, the case you mentioned that I think many jurors are skeptical of any kind of a charge that involves political activity or free speech. But the key element is the use of force. And so, as we saw in this case, at least with regard to Stewart Rhodes and Kelly Meggs, the jury had no problem finding them guilty in light of that evidence that we just heard Ryan talk about using force, using weapons, using guns, hanging Nancy Pelosi, all of those things in the pre-planning. So this is a very important conviction. It says that this charge can be used successfully against fellow Americans, even when there is a component of political speech involved, because political violence focuses on the conduct, not the nature of the speech, not the content of the speech. So really important convictions today.
Yeah, I mean, Glenn, one of the things that Rachel Maddow has pointed out in a conversation we had about her new podcast, which partly is about that seditious conspiracy trial back at the end of World War II, right, is that if you're trying someone for seditious conspiracy, by definition, the seditious conspiracy failed, right? Because they weren't able to pull it off, and now they are in handcuffs. And the fact that the plot did not come to fruition can make it difficult to prosecute because, how serious was the plot? Were they just kind of talking smack, behind people's backs? Do they really mean this? How significant is this conviction for the Department of Justice, given that context?
I think it's really significant, Chris, and I think the effect of these guilty verdicts will stiffen the spine of some and weaken the spine of others. I think it will stiffen the spine of the good, hardworking prosecutors at the Department of Justice who I think they may have felt like they were taking a chance on this one because this is not easy to prove. And I think these verdicts are a real vindication on their decision to lean forward and bring charges that seem to be supported by the evidence. And let's remember, we have other seditious conspiracy trials coming up against additional Oath Keepers, against the Proud Boys. So I see it weakening the spine, potentially, of everybody else who is now pending trial in a seditious conspiracy case. We may see more guilty pleas come in, perhaps even some with cooperation.
Yeah, and these are very serious jail sentences, prison sentences that the convicted defendants are looking at. You mentioned the Proud Boys who are facing similar charges and a similar trial to this trial. That is still pending. Glenn, let me just follow up, and then I'll come back to you, Barbara. As someone who watched a lot of this trial, did you find a distinction between the two individuals found guilty on these most serious charges and the three who weren't?
I did. I think both Elmer Stewart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, and one of his top lieutenants, Kelly Meggs, their language in text messages and posts, social media, and even in some videos, it was so violent. It was so inflammatory. Let's call it what it is. It was seditious. And the other defendants weren't quite as vocal or as enthusiastic. And I think it's important for people to recognize that co-conspirator liability can reach really far. A jury can hold all conspirators responsible for what just one conspirator does, but the jury doesn't have to reach that far if they don't want to. Based on my assessment of the evidence, they really did. It was a very thoughtful verdict. I can see why they returned the verdicts they did, and they reached only as far as they felt comfortable reaching.
To the implications, Barbara, that Glenn just mentioned, we have the Proud Boys, of course, which is upcoming, but you also wonder how it figures into the thinking of the new special counsel Jack Smith and the cases pertaining to January 6th he's overseeing, given that they were able to secure a conviction on what, again, to a non-lawyer just watching, looks like, the rare textbook example of a seditious conspiracy, which is a plot to use violence to stop the peaceful transfer of power. You know, if this isn't it, then nothing is. Are there implications, you think, for how DOJ and the special counsel proceeds from here on out?
I don't know if it would change anything that the special counsel does, but I do think it gives them a much stronger hand, because all of those defendants who are facing seditious conspiracy charges now have to look at this verdict and think that the likelihood of their conviction has just gone up. So to the extent that they, are assessing their likelihood of conviction and the risk, they now have to think seriously about whether they want to enter guilty pleas and cooperate. And cooperation, is the currency of prosecution. That is how you make cases. People come in and they share a tip or a lead. It certainly has to be something that the government can corroborate. They don't rely solely on the word of someone who is cooperating to do himself a benefit. But sometimes that can be the key to really breaking open a case, or someone can just explain things that previously were difficult for a prosecutor to understand how things came together. So I think now they can approach all of those defendants with this new strength of position to determine whether anybody is interested in a plea offer that brings with it cooperation against higher ups.
In terms of the repercussions for the individuals who are charged, Glenn, obviously Meggs and Rhodes face the most serious prison time, but there were convictions secured against all 5 of the co-defendants, and the other 3 will face the possibility of prison as well.
Yeah, and I think the 3 lesser players, at least as reflected by the jury's verdicts, are still facing about 10 to 15 years in prison. But I really think it's the fact of the conviction more than the time they're facing that is the main and important takeaway from these verdicts.
Say more about that.
So I think, as Barb was saying, it really does strengthen the hand of the prosecutors, because there are lots of other J6 defendants out there pending trial. And the other really important thing is these 5 defendants, they defended on not that we didn't do what you see us doing on videotape or what we posted on Signal chats, but they said we are patriots and we were trying to set right.